Today's presentation is part of our World of Work series. In the past few years, we have featured a plethora, I love that word, of speakers, including a CSO flute player, an NFL referee, a midwife, and a Chicago homicide cop. And today we introduce our first arborist and tree expert. It has been my good fortune to know David Conrad for over 2 decades, both as the expert who tends our oaks, our weeping katsura, and our Japanese maple tree. And I've also known him as a dad of one of my former middle school science students. David earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Forestry and Wildlife in 1983 from Virginia Tech and served his college internship at the Morton Arboretum. David has worked in the field with Nels Johnson tree experts of Evanston for 36 years. He's only, 40 now? As I thought. He's the man to call when your magnolia gets black spots or your katsura goes from weeping to sagging. In the early 90s, Mr. Conrad became one of the first certified arborists in Illinois and is a board-certified master arborist, the highest level of certification offered by the International Society of Arboriculture. David is married with 2 kids. And is that up there? Yeah. And last Monday, he became grandpa of his 3rd grandchild. Little hand, come on. I like the name too. Waylon Clyde Sales Conrad. That's cool. He thinks he's going to be a country singer. Waylon's dad, Patrick, was my former student, and under the tutelage of his dad, won first place in 2 consecutive years in the Illinois State Science Olympiad, tree event, and finished in the top 10 at the national competition. His youngest son now works with Dad at Nels Johnson. As they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Good. David's love of the outdoors stems from his outdoor experiences with his dad, a dry farmer. And I can tell you what a dry farmer is during coffee break, as I just learned that. How many know what a dry farmer is?
Dry land.
Oh, you have to correct me, just like your son. A dry land farmer. Well, he'll explain it maybe. And self-described half cowboy, half farmer from eastern Colorado. He has 3 brothers, one being the chief horticultural engineer for Ball Seed, the second an environmental engineer in Canada, and the last having the most earthy job, a stay-at-home dad. With that, I give you Grandpa David. Come on up, David.
Thank you. So I do a lot of work, but not a lot of public speaking, so bear with me, please. I'm going to start by introducing myself, by telling you a little bit about myself. I grew up in rural Glen Ellen in the 1960s and 1970s, semi-rural Glen Ellen, in a neighborhood carved out of a farm, surrounded by field crops and on a half-acre plot with a large backyard garden and a home orchard that my father planted, and my 3 brothers and I, we tended. I had plentiful exposure to the outdoors through family camping trips, first in old canvas tents that weighed enough to really sag the springs on the old station wagon. Then my parents moved into pop-ups and then into trailers. So we got all around the Midwest and Michigan and Wisconsin and all the state parks, and I started to formulate my love of outdoor activity and basically outdoors in general through those many trips. We had wonderful family experiences visiting. My dad was from Colorado, as maybe Matt mentioned, and my mom was from Ontario, well, Winnipeg, but her parents retired to Ontario, so we would go to Ontario one year and Winnipeg the other, or Colorado the other. And when we'd go to Colorado, we'd visit family and then end up in the Rockies. And when we'd go to Toronto area, if we were going in the summer, we'd invariably end up at my uncle's cottage, up north. They just call it going to cottage up in Canada. So I grew up, with all these wonderful experiences and plentiful exposure to the outdoors, and I kind of continued those experiences on my own as I grew up through my teenage years. I organized camping trips with my friends and coworkers I met working at the grocery store and things like that. We graduated to canoe camping trips, and one of my friends here came on some of those canoe camping trips with us back when we were, young and could load up a canoe to the brim and still paddle it down the river. Break camp, set up camp, break camp in the morning and push on. It's just, you have to have a love for it to do it, because it's a lot of physical activity, a lot of work too. One of the trips I took, an organized trip, was when I was at junior college to the Okefenokee Swamp. Opened me up to education through natural experiences. So getting around to my education, I started out at the College of DuPage in pre-law. I came out of high school and I didn't know what to do. I was a wreck physically. I'd had 2 knee operations from high school sports, and the first one didn't work too well. The second one was repeated 2 weeks after I graduated. I hadn't done the typical things. I hadn't even taken the SAT tests and all those type of things. But my mother came from an educated family, and she said, no son of mine is not going to have a college education. So I enrolled at the local community college, which was a good thing for me. It was a good place to start. I figured out pretty quickly that I'm not real fond of accounting and things like that lawyers have to study. And, I went on that Okefenokee trip, and I learned about ecology from Russell Kurt, who was a pioneer in the state of Illinois at restoring prairies. And there's a prairie on campus that I used to volunteer at that's called the Russell Kurt Prairie. And, through my first year there, it was largely, take a bunch of courses. It didn't do too much for me. The second year, I focused in on ecology and biology, and kind of found out that, this is something I can study that clicks for me and works for me. And then I picked a college. I picked a major that I wanted to pursue in college, which was wildlife management. And I started looking at schools. Well, here in the Midwest, I got accepted to University of Illinois, Purdue. And I picked Virginia Tech out of a book just because, it looked nice, nestled into the Appalachian Mountains. I'd never visited, but it was something I could afford. I knew all about Illinois because anybody who's, grown up in Illinois has been down to U of I for something or another. I visited Purdue, and I'm like, boy, it's awful flat and farm-like around here. Not a real good place to study forestry, so I chose Virginia Tech, and it was a good fit for me. About that time, I started working at the Morton Arboretum. The first 2 years I was on something called the collections crew, which was a lot of pulling weeds, digging holes, planting things. And the last 2 years of my internship, I was the assistant to the curator. His name is Ray Schulenberg, and there's also a big prairie named after Ray, the Schulenberg Prairie at the Morton Arboretum. So he was a big influence. I often say I learned more in my summer internship than I did at 4 years of school. One thing I want to mention about going to forestry school back then, I started out in wildlife management and realized I wasn't going to get a good paying job or, earn a living wage doing that, so I switched to forestry. Back then, forestry schools were the provenance of the departments of agriculture. Trees were a crop. We lined them up in rows and we grew them for lumber. When we harvested a forest, we cut down everything and used as much of it as we could. When we replanted monocultures in straight rows, usually mechanically, if you could. If you were on a hillside, there were planting crews that went out and did it. And those replantings allowed the forestry companies to cut more. Shortly after I graduated, sometime in the mid-'80s, or late 80s, early 90s, Department of Natural Resources and schools of natural resources, College of Natural Resources were invented on universities to start looking at things like, forestry schools, and they were turned over from the province of agriculture. And, and they're taught in a completely different way. I've had two sons. One went to University of Wisconsin Stevens Point, go through their urban forestry program, and my youngest son, Sam, who's here with us, went to DePaul University through their School of Natural Resources, and he took he has a natural resources degree from there. And it's very interesting. It was very interesting to see, how the education has differed, because nowadays they look at growing healthy forests for multiple uses, including preservation, recreation, water and soil conservation, plus wood products. And there are many forestry options you can take now, or natural resource career opportunities that you can take now. When I went to school, there was 10 applicants for every job. Many people grew up camping and doing things like I did, and they went into forestry schools, and there was an abundance of foresters for the jobs. Now it's vice versa. For every graduate, there's 10 jobs being offered. I know my son Sam had 3 or 4 offers to choose from when he finished up. So last thing Matt mentioned was certification. When I first became a certified arborist, it was kind of a difficult test. You had to, for instance, with tree identification, you had to know 250 trees, and on your certification test, you had to be able to identify 100 of them and know the Latin names. And it was a point for the correct ID, a point for the Latin name, et cetera, et cetera. My son Sam is the most recent certified arborist in our family, and he doesn't have to know a single Latin name. He doesn't have to know any kind of trees. He has to know how to use a key. For instance, something on your cell phone that you can use to help you identify a tree. So, it's interesting how things change. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not so. The whole idea, though, of being a certified arborist is to professionalize a group. As a trade, tree cutters are sometimes referred to, or tree trimmers are sometimes referred to as tree cutters. And it's to professionalize the group and bring people in, and once we get them in, then we'll educate them more and more. So there's continuing education required to keep up your arborist certification. And then within the certification program, there are several different levels. I became a board certified master arborist. There's only 5% of all certified arborists that are board certified master arborists. That was, again, a very vigorous test, and I passed it with a 76. 75 was passing. I was happy not to have to take it again. And I did study quite a bit for it, but it takes you back to everything. It was an all-inclusive test. You have to remember your days of climbing and knots and safety, and you had to know about things in California, things in Florida, and things up in Canada. So it was kind of a difficult test. But now they have specialties. So you have a municipal specialty. Many of your city foresters are municipal specialists within the certified arboriculture community. You have utility arborists, commercial arborists, and for your workers, you have certified tree workers. So they get a specialty in more, what's applicable in their world. Instead of knowing the things you need to be a certified arborist, they need to know how to work safely, how to use all this advanced climbing gear and things like that. So in the 30 years that I've been in it, the industry's changed a lot, and you just need to keep growing and adapting. So why do tree care? I'm going to leave the podium now. And we'll turn on the PowerPoint. Why do tree care? What benefits do trees provide? Trees help clean the air, absorb carbon dioxide, and release oxygen. They also have the benefit of trapping carbon. Trees filter dust, pollen, fine particulates, and help mitigate air pollution. As a downside, they also produce pollen. Trees conserve topsoil, are useful in bioswales, rain gardens, stream and lakeside buffer strips. Trees intercept and buffer precipitation. In a light rain, you can stand under a tree and stay dry. In a heavy rain, it slows down the speed of the rain droplets before they come crashing down on the soil, causing droplet erosion. So their ability to intercept precipitation is mostly helpful, but sometimes in the case of ice storms or snowstorms, it can be very detrimental. Trees' root systems help hold erodible soils in place, and they've tested sap coming up. They help clean water as well as air. Northwestern University has an environmental science program now, and they've been testing tree sap from there, comparing it to tree sap in central Wisconsin and tree sap from the UP. So on Northwestern's campus, it's all a fill soil, and there's all kinds of different contaminants and such in the soil. Well, that water that comes up in the tree sap is just as clean as in these two rural areas. So you've got that benefit of being able to grow trees on polluted land and helping to restore polluted industrial areas. Trees cool our neighborhoods and shelter our homes, so we use less energy for heating and cooling. You can see the shade on the roof. It helps cool. Evergreen in the wintertime helps protect from, they just help shelter our homes and help us reduce our energy bills by reducing our heating and cooling costs. Also, they're very aesthetically pleasing. It's a big part of why we do tree care is to improve the aesthetics, increase property values. But a lesser known fact is psychologists have studied school children who go to schools in urban areas, in big buildings with very little landscape, and they have by far more mental health issues than kids who go to schools in landscaped suburban neighborhoods surrounded with gardens and trees. So trees help with our mental health issues. With the aesthetics, this is Carolina silverbell, which is just a pretty tree in the area when it blossoms. This is fringe tree on the left and flowering dogwood on the right. We all wait for spring with rebirth, primavera, first green, catkins on a poplar tree. The beauty's out there when you look for it and find it. Trees also provide us with food and shelter for humans and wildlife. Trees support common urban animals like squirrels, raccoons, and beavers, but they also support owls, hawks, bats, flying squirrels, wood ducks, osprey, and bald eagles. So this is what we like to see, nice, fresh, healthy leaves coming out of it. This is a alternate to the Japanese maple is the Asian maple. This is, they call it tiger bark maple because it's got a green and black striped bark to it. A very beautiful leaf, and it's a small garden maple. We all have Japanese maples. Every garden center carries Japanese maples, but they don't carry the paper bark and other Asiatic maples. Along with spring, we get problems that live in our landscape, but we've imported a lot of our problems that plague our landscape. This is a gypsy moth egg mass. Oops. That is a gypsy moth egg mass that contains thousands of leaves, and there's a young gypsy moth caterpillar. And as we've learned, that's the size that we want to treat on. You can see some of the feeding damage there. It's much easier to treat and control these caterpillars before they do a lot of leaf feeding damage. And when they're small, it takes less product, and they're more susceptible to the treatments we use. Early in my career, February 1st, 1984, I was handed a set of climbing tools, rope and saddle, and assigned to a crew to trim parkway trees. That continued in spring with a few occasional varied tasks of tree counts and ID projects. Nowadays, that would be absolutely unheard of, for somebody to just show up at work one day and be handed a set of climbing tools and, go climb those trees and prune out the branches, use chainsaws and, without any training per se of how to use the equipment involved. It just, back then it was kind of a macho contest. Well, if they're brave enough, it was like, you would have heard the same thing from somebody who worked for a combat crew or something. If they're brave enough to go up that pole, maybe they'll stick. It was kind of a testing thing. and it's completely different nowadays. But come spring, you got out of the trees, you started treating all these different things, and you kind of learn about, and as you're scouting for and looking for these insects, you learn about their life cycles, you learn about when they're susceptible to treatments, you learn about better ways to treat them. Early on, we would spray for all these things. We would do what we call cover sprays. They would send us out to a property. You would just spray everything in sight with whatever chemicals you were using. We'd mix up 600-gallon tanks of dormant oil, malathion, diazinon, carbamate, methoxychlor, Saigon. Of all these things, we only use one of these things on the list anymore. Yeah. Funny thing is, a lot of them are still used in agriculture, but you can't. They're illegal in the landscape industry, but you can still spray soybean fields with Saigon, and they still treat orchards for fruit flies with malathion.
Is that the brand name, Saigon?
Saigon is the brand name, yeah.
Sounds like Vietnam.
CYGON. I draw a slip on the active ingredient for that one, but it's a very potent. It was a borer killer. It would get inside the woody trunks and kill borers that live inside woody trunks. That's Zimmerman pine borer larvae coming out funnily through sapsucker holes. But part of it all is learning when they're susceptible. If trees, like spraying these are needle scales on arborvitaes, and they can really build up and turn your lush green arborvitaes brown. So you need to monitor them, get an idea what the population is, and when you see them, you think, I got to spray those things. Well, not now. They're underneath an armored shell right now. You're not going to get them. You have to wait for that to finish feeding, and those are females. There'll be eggs coming out of there, and these little teeny tiny crawlers that you can only see with a hand lens will be out feeding on and that's when you can spray them and get them. To spray them as soon as you see them is a waste of time and effort, and not really good for the environment. Tussock moth larva. Tussock moth is a relative of the gypsy moth. So they have these hairs that are extreme irritants. These long hairs, birds won't feed on them, and as they die off and fall off in our urban areas, the hairs float around like gypsy moth hairs. So if you're allergic to them, you've got problems. When they're just coming out, they go from here to here in a day or two. When they're just coming out, when they're covered in these hairy cocoons, they're not susceptible. But when they come out like this, they are susceptible. And we can use biologicals that will kill just the gypsy moth, something called BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. So it's a virus that kills just Lepidopterous insects and leaves, other insects alone. Pine borer is a tough one, and it takes strong insecticides. But nowadays, we can still spray them, and it's most economical. We have an option. We can do trunk injections, which, because you're using strong insecticides, is often favorable. You're injecting something straight into the trunk of the tree that'll help you control the insect, but there's zero limit. There's zero exposure outside the chemical is all delivered into the sap system of the tree at a low concentrated dose, and none of it's exposed to the environment. Then it also helps when you know what you're looking at. Tussock moth web. These things hang out in here inside the web in the daytime, and they come out and feed on leaves dawn and dusk. They hang out on long silk threads. You could, show up at dawn and dusk and spray them. You could spray with DT, or if there's just a few up in the tree like this and most of the tree is healthy green, you can just leave alone, because that's one of your pests. It's not pretty to look at, but doesn't really harm the tree through the course of the season. Your tree might get infected with that from year to year, particularly to honey locust trees in our area. And it's just not a damaging insect that needs to be treated. Emerald ash borer. I'm getting ahead of myself on the slides. So we covered cover sprays. We used to hit a full property. Now we use prescription applications. If we come in and we've got scale on pines that we want to, or scale on arborvitaes we want to treat, we're not going to spray all the maple trees and oak trees and the evergreen trees. We're just going to spray the evergreen trees. When summer rolls around, we get into fertilizing season. We used to do applications of 20-20-20, broad-based. 20-20-20 means it's 20% of the chemical is nitrogen, 20% is phosphorus, and 20% is calcium. And it was all a quick release. And we used to put it on at a heavy dose of 6 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Nowadays, we do 2 to 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. We use a very slow release nitrogen source and 0 phosphorus. What do we want phosphorus in Lake Michigan in our streams and such for? So we've learned, and we are continuing to learn and adapt to use the products in a better, friendlier way and still get the same kind of results that we're looking for. When we used to do tree inventories, we did them on paper, and we didn't capture much data at all. They were mostly used for budgeting, estimating, and billing. Now we can capture the global GIS location of the tree, the size, the height, the species, the crown spread, the critical root zone, the tree protection zone, the tree risk rating, defects. We can store work history, pictures, and project work schedules. And we can do that with a handheld device. Walk up to the tree, go click, go back to our office and sit down with a laptop and do it. We spend quite a bit more time collecting data, but once we have it, once we capture that up front, we can really come up with good management plans for trees on properties, trees in parks, trees that are broad-based and can be used for a lot of different purposes. Ash borer. When there have been 3 great tree extinctions in the history of our country. The first one was chestnut borer, which hit the Appalachian forests and wiped out one of the most useful trees for lumber and for wildlife. You think about chestnuts roasting by the open fire. Well, those are largely gone in our country and haven't come back. And if they do come back, it's not going to be the same tree. It's probably going to be a genetically modified, hybridized with Chinese chestnut. Pluses and minuses to that. We get the chestnut wood back. We get the chestnuts back. But we're man. We know how to figure out things better than Mother Nature does. Second one was Dutch elm disease. And Dutch elm disease devastated the East Coast. It spread slowly throughout the continent to the West Coast. And there's never been a cure found for it. There are some treatments that are therapeutic. Not therapeutic, preventative. Therapeutically, they don't work. If your tree's got Dutch elm disease, chances are very high that it's going to die. Sometimes slowly, if you fuss over it a lot, you can draw that out to 2-3 years, sometimes 4 or 5 years, other times rapidly. It'll happen within a season. But that's pretty much with us to stay. And so is this critter, the emerald ash borer. It's caused a lot of problems. You look at all these log piles, each one of those was an ash tree in this setting. And just like the other epidemics, well, Dutch elm disease in particular, because that was more of a city tree, but it's been expensive to deal with. It's taken people's budget resources, forced them to spend on removing what were once healthy trees. And when you're tying up your budget, you've only got so much money in the pot. You can spend it removing dead trees, or you can spend it caring for live ones. So it has a lot of different varying effects. We have learned how to suppress emerald ash borer. We can keep ash trees alive, and very healthfully so. It's expensive, it's constant treatment, but we know how to do it pretty darn well. And it's just kind of a lesson that, we can't really do that with Dutch elm disease. Why? Well, we've come to learn that it's easier to kill insects than it is to wipe out diseases. If you have a skin rash, it's kind of hard to get rid of that. But if you've got lice, you can take a heavy dose of a lice shampoo and get rid of them in one treatment pretty much. The skin rash, you have to keep reapplying, and fight it for a couple of weeks. It's the same thing with insects. In the landscape, we learn that we can control insects better than we can diseases. But we don't want to control all the insects. So there are plenty of beneficial insects out there we have to respect and know about and identify. Diseases that we run into, again, Swiss tip blight of Douglas fir. Douglas fir is a western mountain species, and Swiss tip blight, obviously. So many of these diseases and insects are imported. Well, global trade's been good for our economy, but it's been bad for our environment. We've got new tools in our toolbox. We use something called growth regulators. It's kind of like a plant hormone, but it's a little bit different. And when we're transplanting large trees, so I had 2 clients that wanted to transplant trees down in DuPage County, and they hired the same tree spade operator to do both jobs the same day. And this golf course used growth regulator when they transplanted the trees. The growth regulator is injected into the soil, and it's a product, the technical name is paclobutrazol. They actually use it in greenhouses and such, otherwise to make poinsettias shorter and less leggy. Most of the things that we end up using in the landscape industry, they've been through the greenhouse industry first, and then we get to use them. Golf courses use paclobutrazol to keep grass low, so that it keeps their mowing to a minimum. They apply it on their greens, tees, and fairways. And we started using it, in this case, as a transplant aid. So this was with the growth regulator, without. Same species of trees on different locations, about 5-6 miles apart. And you can see, the benefits of these trees were actually bigger than this one was. And what it does is it limits shoot growth, encourages root growth, and shrinks the size of leaves, so there's less respiration needed. Because basically, when you transplant an existing field tree, you're moving a very small fraction of its root system, so you're inducing drought stress. And we've come to figure these things out, and we're getting better and better at it. Mechanical damage is something we don't think about too often, but this is a thin bark tree. This is a showy beech tree, a European beech, behind a fountain, behind in a wonderful estate up in Winnetka. When these boxes were put on and never moved you've got to have landscape lighting, don't you? I mean, trees need to be lit up at night. But you got this bleeding canker disease, which later on, and it's a slow killer, and slowly but surely, and it took a process of maybe 15, 20 years, but it killed this beech tree from installing the landscape lighting boxes. So we learned, hey, we better not install, we can still put the lights on, but let's not drill them into trees. We've come up with expandable bands to hold them on. There's all kinds of different alternatives to hold the landscape lighting on the trees. Sometimes people are just lazy. Let's plant this big, beautiful tree, but let's forget to take off the wrapping. That's a polyester trunk strap, tied tied onto a metal basket, and they just girdled the poor tree. And beavers got to eat too. I don't know if any of you know Northwestern, but that's the new Kellogg school, and this is the lagoon. And the beavers live right underneath this tree stump. So when this tree stump goes, the beavers have, but you don't think about it, but there's all kinds of beavers in Cook County and all around. And some of the animals are good for our trees, some aren't good for the trees. But these trees, unfortunately, due to this student population and the fact that water is used for emergency heating and cooling, and if there's a bad fire, it's the emergency source of water. The trees can't be falling into the pond like the beavers are trying to do. So sometimes the things that we don't see, just a hidden root decay in the tree plate of this big honey locust tree is why it came down. Sometimes the girdling is caused by natural. This was a root. This was already cut. But that's the cut face of the root. And it was wrapping around and choking off this magnolia tree. Sometimes the things that cause trees problems, you show up, the leaves are shrunk, they're yellow, we got to feed the tree. Trees eat. We got to feed the tree. We fertilize trees, we don't feed them. But they feed themselves through photosynthesis. But if they're choking off, they can't move things up and down. So, sometimes it's not an insect or a disease or nutrient deficiency at all. And it's our job to get down on our hands and knees and scrape away the soil and check the root collars for girdling roots because they're a common problem. We still use the old-fashioned tree spade trucks, but when we go out, we can mix 1, 2, 3 different chemicals. It's just not one tank full of the same and spray everything in sight. And this really has helped us do our prescription sprays. And this is kind of a staged photograph to demonstrate things, but we can do soil injection now. Everybody hears about imidacloprid insecticides and honeybees. I like imidacloprid and neonicotinoid insecticides. They're excellent at controlling things like emerald ash borer. I don't want to kill honeybees, so I can inject it into the ground around the tree trunk and get it on target, on site, at the right rate, and not kill any honeybees. They don't tell you about that in the newspapers. But, this is a small tank that makes concentrated solution. This is specified 1 push of the button, and it puts out 250 milliliters. And then there's a gas tank, charges it back up. You push the button again. It's 2 shots per inch of trunk diameter. We've come up with easy formulations and keep it simple, stupid type ways of helping keep our trees healthy. This is kind of a demonstration picture. So this is an elm tree. I don't know if you can see the hoses around the bottom, but we also have the fungicides we can inject into the trunks in a macro injection technique. It would have a much bigger tank. And that's an old technique that started in the 50s and 60s when Dutch elm disease first came around. Well, let's give the tree a shot. We'll give the tree a shot. We'll make it better. We go to the doctor and get sick. We get a shot and we get better. Trees will get better if we give them a shot too. That's the thinking of tree injectables. But if I had my choice, I'd do very little Dutch elm disease injection. I think it's one of those things that, yes, if you have a high value tree and you want to do everything under the sun to protect that tree, go for it. But there's other ways to keep the tree trimmed so we have less beetle activity, keep it healthy, watered and fertilized, and periodically light applications of fertilization. Get your diseased trees out of the neighborhood quickly. Sanitation goes a lot longer and a lot farther, in my opinion, but the injection makes good money. And there's just that philosophy that if we give it a shot, can't we give it something? When you have that emotional attachment to something that's been in your yard as long as you've been in your house, I get it. And there are things we can do, and it's certainly true that these products, we've gotten them the best we can. We've gotten the best application methods we can. It's not fail-safe, but they are very effective at killing Dutch elm disease. The problem is getting them in contact with all parts of the tree to protect the tree entirely from the Dutch elm disease coming in the first place. But like I said, once it's in there, it's pretty much a gone deal. Every once in a while you get lucky, but maybe 5% or less. So chemical fertilizers, like we saw from the big yellow truck put into the ground, are quick and easy, and they've come a long way. But we're reverting back in ways to, you can see the problem here. We've got an old historic hedge, and some of the individual plants are you can see the yellow, you can see the problem. So we're trying to figure out how to do it. Well, quick and easy ways with your chemical fertilizer didn't work. So we designed an experiment for this property. We used 3 different methods. One was a tried and true cattle manure. Composted cattle manure is one of the oldest fertilizers known to man. Has been used since the ancient Greeks started writing about using manure, composted manure to fertilize their gardens and trees. Going back to the South America, the coffee growers, they use something called biochar on the steppes and the mountains, and biochar is coming back. And biochar is holding a lot of promise. It's just really, really expensive. In this project, you've got to figure out how to incorporate the biochar into the soil. Biochar works by, it's not really like charcoal, but it sequesters carbon. It's a carbon-rich, and carbon is the atom that everything sticks to. So by incorporating the biochar in the soil, when we put nitrogen and beneficial elements in the soil for the plants, it sticks to the carbon. And when we get the rain, it releases it. And it works very well, but it's extremely expensive to apply. And to apply it to an existing landscape you broadcast it on top, not really going to work so well. This is a pretty interesting old drill technique. Back to the old again. I don't know, but it makes that hole about 12 inches deep. And we put the biochar mixture, we just used a traffic cone for a funnel into the hole. Tamp it in. And that's how, but can you imagine doing that up and down the whole hedge, two to three rungs of that? That's what it takes. They're using biochar in rangeland restoration in the West. So the cattle and buffalo roam over the range grasses, and they compact and really delete the soil. They're having great success at restoring rangeland by top dressing those with biochar. So they want to bring it into agriculture. Instead of fertilizing farm fields, you've seen the tractors with the big booms out there spraying the fertilizer. If they can treat that field with biochar, then they'll need a lot less of that chemical fertilizer, which runs off into our waterways and ends up in our rivers and streams. But the problem is it's just really, really expensive. To produce the biochar, you burn it through pyrolysis burning, to producing the biochar and then applying it on the fields. But it's a one-time cost. So, up front, if you do it one time, you can really, have an interesting 40 acres or so. So it's being done on small scale. It's also being used in bioswales and things like that, where we're trapping the water that runs off a parking lot before it enters the DuPage River, like the Morton Arboretum. If any of you are familiar with their parking area, they're doing it up at the Chicago Botanic Garden, Highland Park High School. We're filtering the water through these bioswales before it naturally runs off into our runoff creeks, and the biochar is a pretty important component of those bioswales too. And we get into summertime. I'm a big fan of sunrises. It's a beautiful old garden that has a different view, opposite. There's 4 of these little pedestals on the garden. But, it's just invigorating, nice, refreshing. It's a pretty landscape to look at. And, these oak trees in the back, and somebody was asking about musclewood trees earlier. Those are musclewood trees. Young trees. We are in a risky business. Every once in a while you wake up, you look around and it's like, that house looks familiar. Yeah, that's the risky business house. So we want our guys doing this. You know, you think he's got a chainsaw hanging there, he's got a saw strapped to his leg, slings, pulleys, he's got 2 points of attachment. It takes a lot. You don't just throw a rope and saddle at a guy and send him up a tree anymore. So we want this. We do not want this. We want these. So we do a lot of training. We hire guys to come in and train us. We do a lot of in-house training. You know, this trainer gets a pretty good wage to come in and he can teach, I think, 15 students, and then you need an extra trainer. And the guys are all pretty serious. You know, it's not much to get them to pay attention because they know they're in a risky business. And they're happy to be provided the opportunity. And a lot of these guys are certified tree workers, and there's more to it than just, you know, throw a rope and a ladder in the back of a pickup truck. We have best management practices that have been available but are used. Tree and shrub fertilization, lightning protection. You can see, you know, some of it hasn't changed much. 2008 is the most recent. 2006 is the most recent. Cable bracing systems, and you know that's just a sample. But we have for the common practices we do. Our industry, you know, these are all put out by the International Arboriculture, the ISA, International Society of Arboriculture. Some things that I get involved in as a board master, certified arborist, are tree damage consultations. There was a family of 4 sitting on that bench when this branch that is as big as a tree that came off a tree they call the General at a park in DuPage County crashed down on that bench, and unfortunately the grandmother was killed. It was the 2 kids, the mother and the son and a daughter, the mother and the grandmother were sitting on that bench when that came down. And you know, lawyers in our society, lawyers, when they get a hold of things, it gets messy, but they do get a hold of things. So consulting we usually end up doing is in lawsuits like this. This is the only one I've ever been involved in where there was a fatality. Well, actually, there was another one, but there was another lawsuit, never a lawsuit on it. And insurance companies, damage claims, neighbor disputes. It's just interesting stuff. It's different from the everyday tree trimming and tree removal. So this was a support cable that broke. And there were a lot of issues. You know, you start looking around. The park said, oh, we were only trying to protect our roof. Well, the branch didn't go over the roof. There were 13 or 14 of these cables in this tree. They were the wrong size. They were installed improperly. I mean, the intention was there. It was good. This park does its own in-house arboricultural care. You know, they had a certified arborist installing them, but he just made a lot of mistakes. There was lightning protection in this tree, and lightning protection is made with a copper wire. And you get back to those best management practices. If you have cables in the tree, you have to connect them to the lightning protection system. Well, they took the copper wire and wrapped it around the galvanized wire with no dielectric union, and that's part of what hastened that. Right where that cable broke, a few inches away from the tree trunk, things like that. You know, it's like detective work. It was a perfectly solid, big, beautiful tree, but when you look closely, there was the tiniest little bit of embedded bark. And on the other end, you know, it was resulting in blue stain. That was perfectly solid. This accident happened on a calm summer day, but it was a few days after a thunderstorm. Usually some of these things get started, you know, they don't always break during the thunderstorm. Sometimes they let go a couple of days later. And that's what happened here. Storm damage is interesting. Sometimes you get payback. This house got hit twice by 2 different trees. The first time was an ash tree, a large ash tree. And both these trees are on the neighbor's property. But this house is a newer house. And this is on a very affluent street in North Evanston. And they didn't really care too much about these trees when they built the house. The other tree was right about there, and we used this big elm tree to rig it when we took this tree off. Well, they dug this foundation right out to the property line. That's the leeward side. And from the west, when winds come and storms come in, about 5 years later, the ash tree came on the roof. And this followed that up about 2 years after that. It was, and we care for these trees for the homeowner. We care for both properties, actually. But, people always say, oh, if that tree ever comes down on my house, I'm going to be dead. Well, these trees come down on houses, and people don't die. Actuaries say that houses are actually very, very, the safest place to be when a tree comes crashing down is inside the house, not outside walking the dog. Sam. Short story is, we had one of these microbursts come through, and Sam was out walking the dog barefoot. Hey, who knows when a microburst is going to come through? It comes through, and I'm like, where's Sam? Where's Sam? He's not home. Where's Sam? He's not answering the phone. We went up to a house and stood back against it with the dog and just waited it out. But that's another view of the same tree. The crane, it took a crane to get this one off the house. We topped the tree off and left just the trunks. We spent one day topping the tree. The charge for the crane cost more than our fee for the tree removal. It was a $7,000 crane. The damage to the house was less than $1,000. Yeah.
Excuse me, so the roots were softened, or the dirt was softened and the tree is leaning?
The roots were excavated for building this house.
Oh.
So the roots for that tree and the other tree were dug out and basically physically removed. It was a much smaller house on the site, and this is one of the new McMansions.
Oh, right.
So, and they weren't done excavated very carefully. They're just ripped out by the backhoe. 4 or 5 years down the line, the wood decay starts in. So the roots on this side basically held, but there were no roots. The force of the way a root plate works is there's tensile strength and compression strength, and there was nothing to compress. So the tensile, the ground was wet and waterlogged, and
And then which way is west? You were saying the wind blows.
West is this house faces to the south, so west is to the left. So the trees were cut on the east side of the tree, and with the west winds, and they were huge trees. Both ended up on this guy's house. Neither one did any significant damage. He was a high school teacher at Glenbrook South, so he moonlighted in the construction business building these McMansions.
I'm sorry to interrupt all the time, but so there's no one in the village who allows the footprint of the house to be examined regarding the safety of a tree?
Every village has its own ordinances. Some village has tree protection ordinances, some don't. In this case, this is the city of Evanston. They don't have tree protection ordinances. Their philosophy is, we don't need tree protection ordinances in Evanston. Our residents care enough about the trees to protect them themselves. So, in the large part, that's true, but they weren't thinking about rebuilding urban areas. We're tearing down and rebuilding. If you come through, I came down Lincoln. They're tearing down the old buildings in downtown Skokie and building new ones. So there's long-standing legal. You have air rights above your property. You have soil rights below your property. So this is perfectly legal to do. You can't. You can't supersede these traditions.
So you couldn't go back and file some kind of complaint against the builder or the excavator for the foundation?
Probably, but civil litigation, it's hard to prove.
Yeah.
This was another huge tree in Evanston that came over in a storm, all by itself on 2 lower houses, a lot farther drop, boom. I'm overtime, aren't I, Matt?
Yeah.
Yeah. We got this tree off of this house without that chimney coming down. To me, this was a very dramatic, we're hearing in the news stories right now what's going on with Lake Michigan. This is a property up, and this was a beautiful day. And this is a blowout of the bluff, and that's just water cascading down the bluff. If we don't think we're changing the climate, we're kidding ourselves. Climate change is real and it's happening. Those pictures I showed you of the spring flowering trees are mostly from the southern Appalachians, the dogwoods, the fringe tree. We can grow them around here now because we're warming up. This was a beauty, the water settled all down around the outside here. Well, we're into fall. Short story is, that was just water rushing down a bluff in Lake Bluff. And, now we've got houses in Indiana collapsing into the lake. Things we do affect things. Autumn's a beautiful time of year. Spiritual sunrises, we're up in time to see them. Wonderful fall color. Don't forget about growing food in our, we were in Italy for our 30th wedding anniversary, and it just was a reminder of my growing up in Glen Ellen. We ate what we grew in the backyard. A lot of what was served on our table was grown, and we're capable of doing that as people. We get through more trimming, removals, the training we use, we still need. We have equipment that makes our lives a lot easier. Wintertime's a good time to put these support cables in large trees the right way, through using our best management practices. We know we need to bolt these things through. There's no leaves on the tree. Leaves weigh a lot. And when you're winching together big pieces of trees, there's a lot less weight on them without the leaves. There's always storm damage to deal with. So something that was controversial when I was coming up was something called compartmentalization of decay in trees. It's now widely accepted. Basically, trees put up 4 protection walls. They sense that they're being invaded, and they have a way to defend off against the decay. This is the same tree. That's where it got cut. That's the top look, and that's the length of wood. Perfectly solid, 10 feet up, but rotten as can be at the most important part. This is an interesting story. We knew this tree was big. We line up big tree removals for the winter time because we don't want the trees ruining our landscape that we're living in. We didn't know it was filled with cement. First time I ever rented a jackhammer, an electric jackhammer, to take a tree down. They told us that this is an older technique that we don't do anymore, the cementing trees, because it's an incompatible material with wood, and that the wood would decay. They use powdering in Europe and keep these old trees along with decay in them. So don't have enough time to get into. We get into winter, we're still doing tree trimming, tree removals. Wood recycling is a whole different ballgame. Maybe I'll have time for that in question and answer. But when I started, it was burned, landfilled. Wood chips were spread around playgrounds. You can't do that anymore. You need playground certified mulch that costs up to $30 a yard versus free wood chips because some kid got poked in the eye. Lawsuit from the wood chips. Wow. The logs, it's a good time for fruit tree trimming, vista pruning, and thank you for sharing my path.
As you know, being the person that I call many times when I'm worried about my trees, I have lots of beautiful trees that I try to keep healthy. I worry about the climate change when we have a winter like we're having now, where the temperature is above freezing a lot of the time, and then it goes from below freezing to above freezing, and I wonder what effect this temperature fluctuation is having on our trees.
This temperature fluctuation won't be anywhere near as bad as last year's temperature fluctuation. Because last year we warmed up, we had bulbs popping out of the ground in February and then went back into the Arctic freeze. This year we have had 2 snowfalls in April, big ones. Second one after trees were in leaf. 2 snowfalls in October, and one of the warmest Christmas on record. Second warmest Christmas on record. So we theorize, we know what happens. Fall dormancy, it's bad in the spring. Trees, start greening up and leafing up, and then their tissues get damaged by freezes, much like orchards. On a long term, we don't know what's going to happen, but they're suspecting that the forests are going to change. Forest ecologists are out studying the changes that emerald ash borer has brought on, and they're talking about Oak Hickory Forest complex moving farther north, and more of an Appalachian forest happening here in the what we consider the northern parts of the Great Lakes area. So I talked about Dutch elm disease, and there's a few other things on the horizon. Thousand cankers disease that's threatening to wipe out walnuts. Boxwood blight is a new imported disease, is threatening to wipe out boxwoods in our. But in California, there's another canker disease. I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's threatening to wipe out oaks in California, live oaks. So we're expecting hardiness zones to change and tree ranges to migrate further north. And in urban and suburban situations, we'll see a lot more, false dormancies. We'll see frost cracks and a lot more physical defects caused by changes in weather, extreme changes in weather.
You mentioned biological pesticides, which specifically target Lepidoptera. What effect overall is this going to have on the pollinating functions for vegetation of butterflies?
So biological insecticides that target Lepidoptera are actually naturally occurring products. The BT Bacillus thuringiensis that we use to treat gypsy moth with and other caterpillars. There's 2 or 3 different forms of it. Basically, the caterpillars are probably under worse siege from other things that we use in the environment and other farming techniques. As we were kids, we all remember walking down the road. I did growing up in rural Glen Ellen and picking the milkweed pods. They farm right up to the edge of the road nowadays, and they don't leave buffer strips and things like that. So there's other things that are more of a threat to monarchs and such than BT. And it's a naturally occurring virus that they found in Asia that kills these in their native range, and they brought it here to use to fight the gypsy moths. And we can use it on other caterpillars as well as the tussock moths and any Lepidopterous insect it works against. But it's not as effective as, say, spraying carbamate, because one application of carbamate, you'll watch those things drop dead instantly as soon as the carbamate hits them. The gypsy moth, if you get good control, you've got about 40% to 60% kill, and that's considered good control with an application of BT. So 40 to 60% would still be live, and that's okay as long as the tree doesn't get defoliated, because it's really the loss of the leaf surface area, the loss of the ability to photosynthesize that causes the damage to the tree.
When I drive past or through a Cook County Forest Preserves, all I see are toppled trees. I assume a lot are due to storms, and they never seem to be removed. What's the policy with Cook County Forest Preserves?
You'd have to ask them, but I know a little bit about it, and it lies in the word preserve. And by preserve things, we take something and we put it over there and we never touch it. We don't manage it. And the Cook County Forest Preserves are largely guilty of that. I don't want to get into the politics, but that's where every politician's nephew goes to work. They can't get a job anywhere else. You've got Cook County Forest Preserve, you've got Lake County Forest Preserves, you've got DuPage County Forest Preserves. You know, there's several, and Cook County's the worst.
Marilee kind of already asked the question I was going to ask about climate change, but I want to ask specifically about birch trees. We had a beautiful birch tree for 20, 30 years, and then it just declined, and we were told by a tree company that because the bark is so thin, that it was susceptible more to climate change. Do you know that about trees with thin bark, that they're more susceptible?
Depends on what stage of life a birch tree's in, whether the bark is thin or not. Young birch trees have thin bark, but that paper corky bark that we think is thin, because we can pull and peel off a layer of it, it's actually a half-inch thick or so. So mature birch trees don't have thin bark, but they are susceptible. In our area, they grow up in Lake County on the ravines, on a north-facing ravine. That's birch's native range in Illinois. So they are more of a northern species. They're a beautiful tree with that beautiful white bark, so we plant them in our neighborhoods. You need some good help to keep them going, and people can keep them going. That imidacloprid applied around the base of the tree once a year will keep the birch borers away. And usually it's the birch borers that do in the birch trees. And they're bronze birch borer is a native insect. We don't have to blame anybody else for that. They're just a popular tree, and they're also not what's considered a real long-lived tree. But in our suburban landscapes, if we site them on the north side of a house where the ground is shaded and maybe in a little indentation, so even with a light rainfall, that's where the water runs down to, we can grow a birch tree. We put it out in front on the parkway, it's going to die.
It's probably our last question because we learned a lot.
Is there anyone who has a job doing prairie management or a prairie specialist?
Tallgrass Prairie in Schaumburg in Wisconsin is probably one of the premier companies, but there are several. A lot of the big landscape companies, but Tallgrass Prairies comes to mind. Some of these bluffs along Lake Michigan that we clear cut, take the invasive species off and open up. I didn't quite get to that. That was near the end. But the restoration companies come in after and plant native forb layers, grass layers, flowering plants.
Those arborists, or?
No, they're more ecologists, ecological restoration specialists. Sam, you got any ideas on what they call themselves?
That was it. Ecological restoration.
David's going to be around. Thank you, David.